Hello and thank you for joining me on this short video, Raw Fishery Products. This is the 21st in a series of 100 videos on UK food law topics. My name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer. Now you may be watching this video as part of our online training service, or you may be watching it on our YouTube channel. If you're watching it on the online training service, well then there is an additional 1 hour long webinar on this topic, so you can actually have a look at that in a bit more detail. Okay, so today's topic is raw fishery products. So what are raw fishery products? Well, basically it's raw fish, but they're made from maybe just pieces of fish that are chopped up, diced, cut and sliced, minced up, or it could be that they've gone through a less than efficient treatment. What I mean by that, it might be a cold smoke rather than a hot smoke. It could be marinated, it could be lightly salted, partially fermented. The idea is that they're raw because whatever treatment they've been subjected to has been insufficient to kill off the food poisoning bacteria that might be present. So brining, marinating, smoking might be used. So there are lots of different techniques that might be actually employed here, but these will be insufficient to properly control food hazards. So we're talking about cold smoking, where the fish might be subjected to a treatment of less than 60 degrees centigrade. So examples, what are raw fishery products? Well, of course, there's lots of them out there. Fish carpaccio, which is sort of thin slices. You also get meat carpaccios, don't you? But just basically raw fish that's been thinly sliced. We have ceviche, which is a Peruvian dish, and that's marinated, but only lightly marinated. Traditionally, it's sea bass that's used for that. We have gravlax, which is a Scandinavian food. Raw salmon, lightly cured in salt, sugar, but only very lightly, so it's not an effective treatment. Then we have sashimi, which is raw fish, but also could be raw meat, and that could be salmon, tuna, mackerel. And sushi, which is vinegared rice, but may contain raw fish as part of the ingredients. And lastly, we have pickled herring. So very popular in Holland, the Netherlands. It's basically just raw herring soaked in vinegar. So those are examples of raw fishery products. So what are the food safety concerns? Well, there are basically two types or two categories of concerns. The concerns relate to the presence of parasites, and in particular parasitic worms, and also food poisoning bacteria or microorganisms. So let's have a look at the parasitic worms first. The sorts of parasitic worms you can get in raw fishery products include tapeworms, flukes, and roundworms, and infection can be caused by just simply eating the live worms, and unfortunately they can cause all sorts of infections in humans, and things like tapeworms can develop within the gut itself. For microorganisms, what sorts of microorganisms, food poisoning bacteria and other things can we worry about? Well, Listeria monocytogenes. If you're not familiar with Listeria, there's another short video on the control of Listeria you can go and have a look at if you wish. But Listeria monocytogenes is a food poisoning bacteria that can grow at chilled temperatures and is well associated with raw fish. Also Salmonella. Salmonella is sort of a theoretical hazard. It's not really well associated with raw fish, but there have been examples of it. Clostridium botulinum. There is another video on Clostridium botulinum. Well, that can be an issue with raw fishery products if the raw fishery products have been placed into an atmosphere where air is, or oxygen has been removed. So if the raw fishery product has been vac packed, so in other words, placed into a plastic pouch and all the air taken out and sealed, Clostridium botulinum is a very dangerous food poisoning bacteria that can grow at chilled temperatures but in the absence of oxygen, and can produce a neurotoxin, which is very dangerous. So if you've got herring that's been pickled and put into a jar, and what you've done is you've removed the air from the jar, again you've created an environment where Clostridium botulinum could theoretically grow and produce neurotoxin. And lastly, we have histamine. Now, histamine, if you ingest histamine, you know what it's like. We're recording this in sort of spring 2024, so it's April 2024, and the tree pollen is out, so I have to take antihistamines every day, otherwise my face puffs up. So histamine can cause this allergic reaction, this inflammation, sneezing and all the rest of it. And it can be produced on raw fishery products. It's actually quite a complicated process, but the chemical that's commonly associated with raw fish is histidine, and in the presence of certain bacteria, and which are normally present on fish due to poor hygiene during handling, that histidine, which doesn't really cause much of a problem, is converted to histamine. And if you eat that fish, certainly susceptible people might well go into an anaphylactic condition. It can be quite severe. So these are the sorts of things that one can worry about with consumption of raw fish. So what are the controls? Well, there are different controls, obviously, for parasites and different controls to deal with the microorganisms. So let's look at the parasite control first of all. There are two main types of control to deal with the parasitic worms. One is inspection, visual inspection. Often you'll find that when dealing with raw fishery products, they'll be visually inspected by food handlers. They often use candling technique. A candling technique is where you pass the fish fillet over a light, and if you look at it, you might be able to see the parasitic worms. The only downside to visual inspection is whilst you might see the parasitic worms and have them removed, you might not, because obviously it's human error. It's a bit hit and miss. It's not really a fantastic thing to do, but one should certainly give it a go as part of a process to remove parasitic worms. The more effective treatment is freezing, and this is the treatment that's actually specified in hygiene law. So if you're going to place on the market, for example, you're going to use a carpaccio type dish, and therefore you thin slices of fish, then under certain conditions, before you actually serve that to the consumer, the fish must have been frozen. There are different techniques, but the basic principle is to minus 20 degrees centigrade for 24 hours. I said there are variations on that. Now, the freezing requirement is going to be on wild fish. So that's the main issue, because parasites are obviously going to be, the worms are going to be present in the sort of wild, if you like. But if you've got fish farms under controlled conditions, then there are going to be exemptions from freezing. So there are exemptions. The exemptions for wild caught fish really are quite limited. If you can demonstrate that the wild caught fish have been caught from waters where there's evidence that there are no parasitic worms, then you don't have to freeze them. As far as I'm aware, looking at the UK, there is no area around the UK, certainly, where there is an absence of parasitic worms. So that's not something we can really rely on very, very regularly. On the other hand, farm fishery products, if your fish has been produced in a fish farm, and on that fish farm they've taken careful measures to prevent parasitic worm contamination, then the fish can be used for raw consumption without freezing it prior to consumption. Now the freezing, if it's required, remember it's for wild fish, if the freezing is required prior to consumption, it can be carried out at any time during the food supply chain. However, whoever freezes the fish will need to generate a certificate to pass it on down. So if you buy your fish from a market, if the market has already frozen the fish, then they should provide you with a certificate to demonstrate the fish has been frozen, minus 20 for 24 hours or equivalent. So with microorganisms, the food safety controls obviously depend on the microorganism. For listeria, the main concern with listeria is that it can grow at refrigerated temperatures. So one of the key ways of preventing listeria outgrowth is reducing the shelf life. If you've got a shelf life of your raw fishery product of less than 5 days, Listeria monocytogenes does not have the opportunity to grow, so you can control it. But the shelf life would be from the time the fish is caught, not from the time that you receive it, because of course the fish might well have been in other hands prior to yours. The salmonella it's basically what you want is good hygiene. Well, you need this across the board. Very tight hygiene controls, very good personal hygiene, prevention from cross-contamination, proper design and layout of your food establishment to prevent cross-contamination. Because if you've got a raw food here, if it's contaminated with something like salmonella, there is nothing to stop it growing and possibly infecting your consumers. Clostridium botulinum, well, shelf life again. If you vat packed a raw fishery product in order to prolong its shelf life, as long as that shelf life under vacuum does not exceed 10 days, then Clostridium botulinum will not have time to grow and produce neurotoxin. This is on the assumption that it's being kept at refrigerated temperatures of 8 degrees or less. If you're keeping your fishery products at 3 degrees or less, then Clostridium botulinum can't grow at all. And there are other, you'll see on the slide, and probably small writing behind me, other controlling factors like pH, depending, remember I talked about herring being pickled. If the pH of the herring is actually below, you're very acidic because of the vinegar throughout the fish flesh, then that can be a controlling factor. Water activity, the AW, is the water available for microbial growth. If that's reduced because of salting or something of that nature, then again, that can help to extend the shelf life. But you can see here, shelf life and personal hygiene are really important, as well as prevention from cross-contamination. With histamine, I said that you might have histidine on the fish, and that can be converted to histamine by certain bacteria. Those bacteria tend to come from poor personal hygiene from food handlers and temperature abuse. So if proper personal hygiene, keeping the raw fish cold, should prevent the possible formation of histamine in the food. Well, as I said, that's one of over 100 videos that I'm producing on food law topics. So if you want to watch the other 99, then please have a look at our YouTube channel or subscribe to our online training website, where you can also download additional resources and of course watch webinars, which are typically about an hour long, on each of the topics I'm covering here. Thank you for listening. I'll see you on the next video.